the party's presidential nominee. The head of the US Secret Service has resigned following an assassination attempt on Donald Trump earlier this month. Yesterday, Kimberly Cheatle admitted it was the department's most significant operational failure in decades. And ministers are being told they'll have to tell people to avoid travelling by train between Birmingham and Manchester in future. Whitehall's spending watchdog says the scrapping of HS2 will mean reduced capacity. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 31 points at 81.67. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.18. LBC weather largely dry and settled for much of the UK tonight and a low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question with me, Iain Dale. Joining me on the panel today, we have Sophia Gaston, Head of Foreign Policy and UK Resilience for the Foreign Policy... So I'll start that again, for the Policy Exchange think tank. Kirsty Blackman is SNP MP for Aberdeen North. George Parker, political editor of the Financial Times. And Lisa Smart, debut on the programme because she's a newly elected Liberal Democrat MP for Hazelgrove. Welcome, Lisa. Welcome to you all. You may want to ask them a question, because if you don't, we'll have a very empty hour with me asking the questions. That never really works, does it? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and you can text on 84850. We'd love you to watch us on Global Player. And to JS, who sent a WhatsApp message, when are you getting the Green MP Sean Berry on? Very soon, but we have a Green MP tomorrow. Ellie Chaz will be joining us. So let's kick off with our first question from Joseph in Stroud. Joseph.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
I've only done about 400 of these programmes, so you'd think I might know that I have to wait for the sting before I introduce the first caller. Joseph, what would you like to ask?
Hi there, Ian and panel. Right, so has the SNP done Keir Starmer a solid by giving him an opportunity to stamp his authority on the Labour Party by throwing out any Labour rebels?
What was that phrase? Done Keir Starmer a solid?
Yes. Done him a favour by giving him an opportunity to identify people who would not be loyal at the first hurdle, and giving him an opportunity to throw them out in a very public way and stamp his authority on the Labour Party.
Kirsty, it's all backfired.
It's all backfired. I don't think so. I think it was really important to bring this issue to the House. I think it was really important because so many people brought it up with us on the doorsteps, because so many organisations made absolutely clear this is the best way to reduce child poverty overnight, right? It would bring 300,000 children out of poverty. It would take 700,000 into less deep poverty than they're currently in. So it genuinely is one of the biggest issues of the day. And, the Labour Party should have had a founding mission of their government being to reduce child poverty. I don't see how you can argue with that. In terms of, Keir Starmer's decision-making process, in terms of whether these Labour MPs will lose the whip, I mean, it would be distressing for me. I think it would be distressing for a lot of folk that support Labour to see them be so nasty to the left of their party, if you see what I mean, to see them be against people that are supporting reducing child poverty. I think that would be a really significantly bad issue for the Labour Party, and it would make it even worse than it currently looks. But, they've got such a massive majority that even if they've got 7 Labour MPs voting the wrong way, then they're still winning the vote by a significant margin. I think for us, ensuring that was on the agenda, we got more votes in this than we got last year in the King's Speech, or last time in the King's Speech. We got more votes in this than the Lib Dems got. We got significantly more votes, 4 times the votes that the Lib Dems did as fourth party in the last King's Speech. So I think for the SNP, it was a great opportunity to raise this issue, to talk about the issues that matter to our constituents, and whatever Keir Starmer decides to do is up to him.
It was a political stunt, wasn't it?
Well, I think you could probably call everything that politicians do a political stunt, whether you're standing on a paddleboard or whether you're doing something in Parliament, right? Everything that politicians are doing is to either change the legislation or to get airtime for an issue that they care about. And everybody's talking about it. Everybody's talking about it.
Well, that is true.
That's really important.
We spent the last hour talking about it with our listeners, and it was kind of one-way, well, not totally one-way traffic, but almost. George Parker, how do you analyse this?
Well, it's the first big test for Keir Starmer, isn't it, really? I mean, this is a big moment in the House of Commons, a vote on the King's Speech, and you've got 7 Labour MPs voting with an opposition party, the SNP in this case. What do you do if you're Keir Starmer? He's got 2 options. Either he's tough and basically throws the 7 out of the party or suspends them from the whip. That would have a certain attraction to him because these are people on the left of the party, people like John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, Richard Bergen, Rebecca Long-Bailey, the usual suspects as they would be seen in Keir Starmer circles. The problem is, as Kirsty was alluding to, if you're tough on this issue that people do care about and they think the Labour is on the wrong side of the argument, does that cause more trouble in the long term? The other choice he has is to say, well, there's only 7 of them, let's let it go. The problem with that, of course, is do you think rebels in future will have a green light to wear their heart unless they even vote against the government as well? So it's a tough choice. And as far as I can see on Twitter so far, these people haven't lost the whip, but we'll be watching very closely the next hour or so.
Well, we don't know definitely that that's what they were threatened with, but that is the rumour, isn't it?
It was floating around at Westminster all day that they were being told that this was would be seen as an extremely serious issue. You know, this is the King's Speech. These people were elected on a manifesto which didn't include removing the 2-child benefit cap. And Keir Starmer expected total loyalty from his MPs, which he hasn't got. So
I love John McDonnell's justification for this. He says, I'm following Sir Keir Starmer's example. As he said, put country before party.
Well, I mean, look, John McDonnell has thought for a long time that people in Starmer's office are out to get him. And now Starmer has the golden opportunity. It'll be fascinating to see whether he takes it or not.
Lisa Smart.
It was my first vote ever as a representative
it would be, wouldn't it?
in
it was exciting.
Parliament. It was quite exciting. It also took about 20 minutes, which is an absurd way to run a country. And there were hundreds of people there queuing to vote, and all of those people could have been doing something more useful. So I am struck ahead of the establishment of a House of Commons modernisation committee that will be debating on Thursday. I am struck of the very desperate need for that. But yeah, it was in the Lib Dem manifesto that we wanted to scrap the 2-child benefit cap. I was very pleased to be able to vote for that as my first vote. It is, as Kirsty says, one of the things that all the experts in this area say would dramatically impact child poverty. Child poverty, as we know, stops kids from learning and it casts a really long shadow. It's a shame that the Labour government doesn't yet feel able to scrap it. Whether they will feel able to in future, we don't know. Lib Dems voted to scrap the cap, and I think that was the right thing to do.
OK. I know not your area, Sophia, but I'm sure you have a view on it.
Well, I think it's fair to say that, an incoming government may not want the silver or to position the silver bullet or the kind of primary focus, the instrument by which they're going to address this really, really serious problem of child poverty to be singularly done through the welfare system. I think it is reasonable for them to look in a kind of holistic way about this, at this issue in the round and all the other different kind of connected issues and policy areas, and think about all the other levers that can be put together in a kind of package and then go for it. And that seems to be the way that they're sort of trying to come at this issue. I do think in political terms, this is going to be a really bumpy Parliament. There's not much money to go around. Situation.
Just to interrupt a second, the breaking news is that the whip has been suspended for all of those 7 rebels, which I have to say I'm quite surprised by. I didn't think they'd actually go through with it, because that set a bit of a precedent there, hasn't it? Now, it may mean that in the future everyone toes the line a bit more than they might have done otherwise. But I'm not sure it's good for parliamentary democracy. Sorry, Sophia.
Well, my point was just going to be that if you look at the fact that there's no money domestically and we've got a really bumpy ride in the geopolitical environment, this is going to be a tough parliamentary term. So if you're not firm at the beginning, there's going to be so many other areas where it's going to be really difficult to maintain party discipline moving forward. So I absolutely understand why they've chosen this issue to take the line.
I mean, how can John McDonnell not be a Labour Party MP? Like, he's the very embodiment of so many of Labour's kind of, positions and historical positions and position on the political spectrum. And now he's had the whip suspended. I mean, it just baffles me. It's unbelievable, actually, that they've done that for somebody that's got so much longevity and gravitas and influence within the wider public. Actually, people listen to him. So I was at a rally once and he was speaking at it, and he was phenomenal. I have never heard anyone capture a crowd in the way that he did at that rally. It was really, really impressive. And it kind of reminds me of when Ken Clarke was having issues with the Tory party, and there's no more embodiment of the Tory party than Ken Clarke, and, ended up during Brexit being on the other side of some of the arguments. And it feels like that kind of watershed moment.
But I mean, this is an important issue, but it's not a constitutional issue. Does it merit the suspension of a whip by rebelling on this, George?
Well, I think they've made the calculation they need to instil discipline, as Sophia was saying right at the start of this Parliament, because it's not a constitutional issue, but it is the King's Speech. It's the embodiment of what they were elected to deliver. And to have people rebelling in the first few weeks, you can see why they did this, because the problem is if they deliver on some of the things they say they're going to deliver on, they're going to require total discipline from their party. I'm thinking here particularly on the planning reforms they're going to introduce, because those planning reforms will have every single Labour MP will have campaigns in their backyards led by the Liberal Democrats, I suspect, and the Conservatives, and probably maybe the SNP as well. I don't know.
You're not saying the Liberal Democrats are NIMBYs, surely?
I certainly am saying that.
What a calumny.
Well, I think I should probably come in at this point and do this absolutely outrageous slur from across the other side of the table. We're in favour of the right homes in the right places. We've got really ambitious plans. Well, if you look at Stockport, so in my patch, we've got a mayoral development corporation which brings together the public and the private sector, and it's putting actually quite a lot of homes in the town centre in Stockport. And that's really well served by a good railway line, by good buses, a new transport interchange. I shouldn't talk it down. It's not just about buses. But putting things there rather than concreting over the green belt, we do need more homes. Everybody agrees that. It is thorny in lots of places. But I get why local people get grumpy when they can't get a GP appointment, they can't get their child into the school that's near them, and then hundreds or thousands of new homes are being proposed near them. So I understand why people are grumpy. We do need to do things with communities there. We as Lib Dems think planning should be community-led, not developer-led. And that's why we would do things differently, I think, than the old government, and certainly than we've heard said by this government. But we're interested to see the proposals when they come out in more detail.
Kirsty, have you got other sort of guerrilla tactics in mind to undermine the government? Because given that your parliamentary party has been reduced from 50-odd to 9,
yes,
you've clearly got to adopt a bit of a different approach. I don't say that to rub it in, it's just a fact, isn't it?
As Chief Whip, I am keenly aware of how many MPs that we've got.
But your job's got a lot easier.
I wasn't Chief Whip before, so my job's got a lot more difficult. So looking at the numbers that there are, and I'm keenly aware of where all 9 of my MPs are at any moment, as you would imagine. But in terms of guerrilla tactics, right? I've always been one for using parliamentary procedure to ensure that we can get our voice heard. And we did that very, very successfully in a number of issues. If you think about the walkout that happened a few years ago, that saw a massive uptick actually in the number of people joining the SNP, and was really clear about the fact that our voice wasn't being heard. Now, is that a guerrilla tactic? Or is that us using the parliamentary procedure? If they're going to continue to have these standing orders that are immensely stupid and not reform them, then I'm going to stick to them and use them.
I imagine you'll be doing stuff on the war in Gaza as you did before the election. I mean, that's an obvious thing where you can try and trip the Labour Party.
Indeed, one of our manifesto commitments was around putting forward a bill about the Palestinian statehood, where we also put forward an amendment that didn't get voted on today because we only got one voted on today, around the cessation of arms sales to Israel. And, we were, not just during the election campaign, but Stephen Flynn has been the voice in Parliament calling for a ceasefire.
I think Layla Moran's had, as the first MP of Palestinian heritage, has had quite a lot to say about it.
Not a competition, Lisa.
No, but I think the voice, is possibly...
But these are the exact sort of issues that Starmer and his team have to look at coming down the track when they're taking this decision on the suspension of MPs, It's,
I mean, I wonder if this is look, the election was only, 2.5 weeks ago, but I wonder if this is the first time where they sort of think to themselves, this government lark is not as easy as we thought.
It's possible. And people have said, does it make it easier or harder for him having a large majority? Do people, in the circumstance where you have a huge majority, it doesn't really matter how you vote, does it embolden people like the seven we've just been talking about to basically do what they want and to stick to their conscience? And I think that's obviously a concern that Keir Starmer has, that it can't become a free-for-all because the Labour Party then starts to look like a rebel. Do you mind if I just quickly go back to something Lisa said earlier, just a little parliamentary point? Because Lisa was complaining about the correctly antiquated system of voting in the House of Commons and how it takes 20 minutes to do it. The only thing I would say, having covered it for a long time, is that MPs actually really come to appreciate the 20 minutes they have in the division lobbies when they can rub shoulders with the Prime Minister, with ministers, raise local constituency issues. And so it's quite a precious moment, I think, for backbenchers to actually get their point across in a sort of informal way. And you don't get that in other countries, actually. You don't get Prime Ministers and ministers coming into the Parliament necessarily to actually vote on a nightly basis. So just an observation.
Yeah, I've heard that before, and I can see the merit in that. One thing that I want to praise the government for is that today I went to a ministerial drop-in with the DCMS ministers, so Lisa Nandy, Chris Bryant, I've forgotten the name of the others, I'm sorry, but they were very good and competent. And they were open to being lobbied on constituency issues from MPs. So I went to go and raise the issue of rack in the roof of a local community theatre, and I thought that was a really positive thing. There should be more of that and less of taking 400 and odd, as it was this evening, quite busy people's time to walk through a lobby and be counted.
Well, that is your job.
And
I'm happy to vote. It's a huge honour to have the job. I think there are some ways that would make the job more efficient so that I could better serve the people who've elected me.
A text here, Rafi says, do you think these suspensions are only in the short term? Well, normally they would be, but you're expected to work your passage back. And if you look at who these seven are, they ain't going to do that.
Yeah, there are plenty of other opportunities for them to vote in an unhelpful way.
Some even more breaking news here. James Cleverly has confirmed that he will run to be the new Tory leader in a social media video. He's the first person to officially enter the contest. George, that's quite a surprise in some ways because he had said he wouldn't run.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been swirling around for a while. I think there's been a growing expectation he would stand, but it's interesting that he's the first one out of the traps. The nominations open tomorrow and close, I think, on Monday. So we've got 4 days in which people like James Cleverly can come out and declare their candidacy. But I mean, he obviously hopes he can be the sort of centrist Brexit candidate. I personally think he'll be a good candidate, actually. He's someone who sort of has a certain amount of authority at the dispatch
He's
box.
actually very likeable as well, which is important in these contests, I think.
Gets himself into trouble, as he did in the last Parliament, making unfortunate remarks at a Downing Street drinks party. But people do genuinely like him. People sometimes joke that
what did he do?
It was a Downing Street Christmas drinks party where he joked in inverted commas about putting date rape drug into his wife's
drink. I do remember that now.
Which was then reported. It was meant to be an off-the-record conversation, but ended up in the Daily Mirror, I think. But I mean, generally, he's regarded as a popular figure in the House of Commons, quite consensual, quite moderate on the issue of Brexit, which he did support. And I suppose the question is, how far to the right does the Conservative Party want to go? And Cleverly may not be a person if you want to start chasing Nigel Farage's tail.
Well, you may want to ask about this. 0345 6060 973. We'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. It's 8:20.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
21 minutes past 8. Well, we've had lots of breaking news in the first quarter of the programme. I wonder what could possibly happen over the next three quarters. With me in the studio are, he says, getting his list so I get their titles right for the first time, Sophia Gaston, Head of Foreign Policy and UK Resilience for Policy Exchange, Kirsty Buchanan, SNP
Close.
MP.
Kirsty Blackman.
God, I'm
Sorry.
There's a journalist called Kirsty
Do you know,
Buchanan.
I think I should retire.
No, don't do that.
Kirsty Blackman, SNP MP for Aberdeen North, and, I'm writing in here, SNP Chief Whip. George Parker, Political Editor of the Financial Times, and Lisa Smart, the Liberal Democrat MP for Hazel Grove. Were you expecting to win, Lisa?
I was really hopeful. I'd stood before and lost, and can confirm winning is better than losing on balance.
On that bombshell.
I think when you've stood and you've had people say to you, well, you're absolutely definitely going to be the MP next week, and then you weren't, you go into that slightly protective mode of waiting until you hear. So I didn't write my acceptance speech until my agent called me from the count to confirm that we'd won. And it's great. The challenge now is to work out how to do all the things that I want to do and make the changes and fix the problems. And yeah, I've got a long list of things I still need to work out how to get done.
Because there had been a Liberal Democrat MP for that constituency, Andrew Stunnell, who died recently, didn't he?
He did. He did, and he will get a mention in my maiden speech when I get to do one. Yeah, so it's only ever been held by the Lib Dems or the Liberals, if you go back far enough, or the Conservatives. It was Michael Winstanley as well, who was a radio presenter and GP in his time. Andrew Stunnell, more recently, William Ragg, and between Michael Winstanley and Andrew Stunnell, it was Tom Arnold. So I'm the first woman to represent
I remember
Hazel
Tom Arnold.
Grove.
It was the first time I applied to be on the candidates list. He was vice chairman in charge of candidates, and he rejected me.
Oh.
I was only 26, but anyway. Right, let's go to a WhatsApp question from Ian. It says, I think we all agree it's right that Biden has withdrawn from the presidential race. He's clearly not mentally fit to be president, so why is he still president? See, I think that's going to be a question that a lot of people are going to be asking. Sophia?
Well, I think the decision to withdraw was motivated by the fact that he was not strong enough to actively campaign to a sufficiently high degree to meet the stakes of the election, which are considerable. And also that I think, the American people had concerns about his capacity to fulfill another 4-year term. So
What about the next 7 months?
Well, I think that's a fundamentally different question. Campaigning versus, governing is different, and also governing for 7 months versus governing for 7 months plus another 4 years is different. I think, in part because he has an outstanding team around him, and this is why he has actually been an extremely effective
So you think
president.
it's okay to delegate the running of the most powerful country in the world to his team around him?
Well, I think to some degree, he's always had a team that have been stepping up, and he's have been very strong. He's had Blinken and Kerry and all sorts of really talented people in there, and that's why they've got so much done. I don't think he is incapable of adding value, and I think actually it's interesting. One of the things he's basically said he's going to be focusing on is trying to end the war in Gaza. That's his sort of final kind of focus. And, he actually has personal relationships and, historical insight and some different tools that he can draw upon in that role, which I think he is well placed to do that. So I don't see any concerns there. I think it's understandable the question is raised, but I don't think it's really of any concern to anyone wondering about whether or not America will be an effective power over the next 7 months.
George?
Well, I think I agree with Sophie largely. I think it would help if Biden made it absolutely clear the reason he's not contesting the presidency is not because he's incapable of doing the job, but rather he thinks he would be incapable of doing it for another 4 years, and make that absolutely clear and not able to withstand that.
I don't think he does think that. I think he personally still feels that he could do it, but he's been forced out.
And the problem for him now, of course, is there'll be pressure from inside the Democratic Party for him to step aside as president to give Kamala Harris a run at the job, sort of give her some of the prestige of the job, put her out on the world stage for the next few months before the election in November. So
that might not be to her advantage, though, because I mean, if you're running for president, you want to run for president. She would probably want to spend all her time doing that, because she's been a bit of an anonymous vice president, hasn't she? So she's got to get her. I mean, we played a bit of her speech earlier because I said I think people want to hear what she sounds like, because not many people do know what she sounds like.
Exactly. Well, one thing's for sure is it's electrified the campaign.
Yeah.
And it seems to have wrong-footed Trump as well, which is probably no bad thing. But I mean, if you just look at the donations that have been pouring in to her campaign over the first few days.
Which no one would have predicted.
Extraordinary money coming in from Wall Street. And you can tell that the big money people are desperate to keep Trump out of the White House. They know that there's a danger, to the stability of the American economy with Trump in there. And they're backing her to the hilt. So she's coming in with a fair wind behind her. The fact she stitched up the nomination so quickly, I think, is to her credit as well. She seems to have made a pretty strong start so far, I think. But as you said, for people on this side of the Atlantic, she's a blank sheet of paper. Most of us have never, as you say, never even heard her speak before.
Well, she's become a social media phenomenon. That's been the most amazing part of all of this. And the really extraordinary thing, and thing that could be consequential there, is that, if we think about what happened, some of the recent results, it's been the Gen Zs in part because of, Gaza and things like that. There's been turnout issues, questions about whether or not Biden would be able to kind of corral this group of, pretty important cohort for the Democratic base to turn out. If you look at what's going on Instagram, on Twitter and so on, it's insane. I mean, it's, she's been endorsed by Charlie XCX. It's turned into this whole kind of zeitgeist meme culture. It's crazy. I've never seen anything like it. But this is the point. It's a phenomenon. And if they can keep up that pace and use that effectively, if they can get, they've had a Beyonce endorsement, if they can get a Taylor Swift endorsement, this might sound trivial, but this is the stuff. If you can get those people turning out in droves, then, that really could make a difference.
I see the bookmakers' odds, I think, are about 40% on Harris winning the presidency. Whereas I think most of us would agree if Biden had stayed in there, the chance would have been close to zero.
Okay, Lisa.
I think it's about time most developed economies have a woman leader. And it'll surprise nobody whatsoever that the Lib Dems' values sit more closely with Kamala Harris than they do
Just
with Donald
remind me
Trump.
the last time the Liberals had a woman leader?
2019.
Yeah, that worked out well, didn't it?
There was a lot going on at the time. I thought Jo did a great job in lots of ways. I didn't agree with her on everything, nor would you expect me as a Liberal Democrat to agree with every Liberal Democrat on everything.
That is true. You can come back. Already we like Lisa. We like the cut of her jib.
I think it does, to us looking, having had, what have we had now, 3 women prime ministers and indeed a First Minister in Scotland, I think it does just seem odd to have a developed country that hasn't had a woman leader. And it matters, right? I remember going and doing a careers day at a primary school, and it was when Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister of Scotland, Theresa May was Prime Minister of the UK, and they'd had the first official meeting, and I was doing this careers day, and a group of girls came to speak to me because I was doing politics as careers, because that's what women do. That's what girls do. They do politics. They run stuff. And it really matters that we've got role models stepping up and leading. So, yeah, I think the UK government should work with whoever the American people decide should lead them. Lib Dem values fit more closely.
OK, but anyway, back to the question. Why is Joe Biden still president?
I think it's up to the American people. It's the system that they've got. I think Sophia was right in that, yes, you are the leader, yes, you are the president, but you have a team around you. You cannot possibly make every single decision that is needed when you're an MP, never mind when you're the leader of the free world.
I remember when my niece Emma was about 7. This was about 1988, and she said, "Uncle Ian, can a man be Prime Minister?"
Yeah.
And I mean, it shows sort of. I mean, now we're totally used to having female leaders. I mean, they haven't all been a huge success, but one or two of them have. Kirsty,
around the kind of why he's still president, and sort of, you know what? Until 3 weeks ago, I would have told you that campaigning is more physically and mentally demanding than being an MP. And now I'm chief whip, right? And maybe only a group of 9, but it has been more physically and mentally demanding. I've done more steps today than I've done in most of the campaign. Because we're arguing over who's getting which office. It's just, honestly.
Important issues of state.
Believe me, this is a key. Well, I came out of my office today and there was an MP sitting on a cardboard box outside my office in a Zoom call on his laptop, which was balanced on a bin. That's where we are in the House of Commons right now. So everybody wants an office, understandably.
So how have you got one?
Because I was an MP before, so I'm just returned to my office that I had before. The newbies are all in massive shared spaces, and having private meetings is just about impossible. But, I can understand why doing the job actually is easier than some of the campaigning stuff. I think on Kamala Harris and, the fact that we haven't heard about her, right, doesn't mean that she hasn't been doing a significant level of the heavy lifting in the background. When Ian Blackford was leader and I was deputy of the SNP, you kind of always get the woman doing a significant portion of the work, but it's not talked about nearly so much as the male leader who's in that position. So I imagine that she has been doing a huge amount of work. I imagine she knows inside out what the president's job involves, more than the vast majority of people who could possibly stand for president. And I'm actually looking forward to being able to see and hear more from her, because she won't be in Biden's shadow in the way that she currently is.
Judy in Connecticut has WhatsApped in saying a vast amount of the millions made in donations have come from small donors, not just big corporations. Please clarify that. Don't underestimate Kamala Harris. She is used to putting sociopaths in jail and she will handily dispense with Trump. I think you're right. We shouldn't underestimate her. I mean, her first 2 years in the job, let's face it, were not a huge success. But cometh the hour, cometh the woman, as someone once said. I don't know who it was, but anyway. It's 8:33. Let's get the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
7 Labour MPs who voted against the government on an amendment to scrap the 2-child benefit cap have had the whip suspended. The Commons voted against the King's Speech amendment brought by the SNP. James Cleverly has announced he'll run to be leader of the Conservative Party. The former Home Secretary is the first to formally enter the race and says he wants to unite the party. And Kamala Harris has been cheered by more than 3,000 people at the first rally of her campaign to become US president. She told supporters she's secured enough backers to become the Democrat candidate to go up against Donald Trump. LBC weather largely dry and settled for much of the UK tonight and a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:36, Sophia, Gaston, Kirsty, Blackman, George Parker and Lisa Smart with me taking your calls. A text here from Justin which says, do the panel agree with me that Iain Dale's obsession and criticism of the Labour Party's first few weeks in office disturbing and indicative of an underlying inability to acknowledge how toxic the Tory party, which he sought to represent, are? Well, if I may say, Justin, I think I've actually been praising the Labour government for the first 2 weeks. I think the only criticism I've remarked on was the fact that the immigration announcement, which Keir Starmer made last week, was, I thought, a little bit weak. But other than that, I've said they've hit the ground running. I thought they made some good ministerial appointments, and it's been a very successful first couple of weeks. So I don't know what you're talking about, frankly. Let's go to Tony in Saddleworth. Hello, Tony.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. Just a quick one for you. As the Labour Party seem to be continuing to unpick all the Conservative policies, the latest one, BBS Stockholm, should we now hold a referendum whether we should go back into Europe to preempt what everybody knows is coming?
Wow. Lisa?
The Prime Minister ruled this out explicitly. My colleague, I think it was Callum Miller, asked a question about a youth mobility scheme so that young people could work in different European countries. And while the Prime Minister clearly had some sympathy with the idea of essentially free movement for young people, he explicitly ruled out free movement and re-entering the European Union, single market, customs union. We as Lib Dems have got, as you would imagine for us, a really detailed, quite wonkish plan on how we would improve our relationship with Europe, and we will be pushing the government to do that. Any business person, whenever you knock on their door, they talk to you a lot about some of the challenges that they face, and these are not Brexit ideologues in either direction. They're just talking about the practical challenges that they face in running a business that exports or imports.
You have a policy to rejoin the European Union, don't you?
We, at the moment, no.
Not at the moment.
No, we don't. No, because that's not where the country is. I think we want a much closer. We want a much closer relationship with the European Union. We want to rejoin the single market because we just think that would make things a lot easier. Look, I'm.
But we'd have no say in the regulations of the single market.
We wouldn't have started from here, I think, is one thing to say. I'm a passionate internationalist. I am European. We have to, all of us, deal with the situation of where we are, and that is that we have left the European Union. There are so many things that could be done to improve the relationship between the UK and our European neighbours. I think, actually, in fairness to the Prime Minister and the new government, they have taken some steps to do that. The timing of the NATO summit and the timing of the European meeting that they had at Blenheim Palace, I think, helped them to do that, build some of those relationships. Because the last however many years, since 2016, it has felt like we've had a government that's just been standing on the White Cliffs of Dover shaking a fist at people trying to pick a fight so that it could find new friends. I don't think you could accuse Rishi
Sunak of that, could you? I mean, I understand Liz Truss, particularly Liz Truss, and maybe Boris Johnson, but not Rishi Sunak.
I think... Who are you comparing him with? If you're just comparing him with Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, he was less picking a fight. I think that's fair to say, Ian. I don't think that he was as warm and as collegiate as he could have been.
I mean, one thing I think Ian's right. One of the things he did do was he got that deal over Northern Ireland, didn't he, with the European Union, so-called Windsor Framework, and the atmospherics did improve, but I think it's fairly right to make this point that if you look at what he said about the European Convention of Human Rights, which we have to stress isn't part of the EU but nevertheless has Europe in its title, he repeatedly referred to that as a foreign court and threatened to withdraw from it if it got in the way of his Rwanda scheme. And that really wound up European partners because it did give the impression that we were in some way distancing ourselves from our European partners and our international obligations. And as Keir Starmer pointed out at the European meeting at Blenheim Palace, the European Convention of Human Rights was something which was basically Churchill's idea, put into practice by a Treaty of London in 1949. So, I don't know. I mean, to answer the very good question, it doesn't feel to me like Keir Starmer's going to waste any of his political energies, at least in the first term of a Labour government, getting back into the quagmire of European negotiations about rejoining the single market of the customs union. But I still think that the FT was very strongly against Brexit. It's a generational thing. I don't think it's going to be an issue on the table in the next 5 years, probably not in the next 10 years, but you can easily imagine in 15 years' time, the issue does come back onto the table.
Kirsty, you'd like it back on the table now?
Iain, you're going to ask me if we're keen to have another referendum on something that we disagree with. We disagree with the decision that's made.
I wasn't going to, but I could do.
I mean, I think the SNP's position is pretty clear. And, Lisa's right, the Lib Dems did have a position to rejoin the EU and moved away from that in recent times. Our position is that an independent Scotland should be a member of the EU. Our position is that Brexit has been massively damaging and we should go back into the EU. And, our position is that we should have a referendum on Scottish independence. But
you're not getting that now, are you?
Nor are we getting the referendum on EU membership. It looks like. I think the single market and the customs union are important, right? And actually, in terms of international trade stuff, I made a significant number of arguments, particularly in advance of Brexit, about some of the issues that there would be that have now come to pass, and was heavily informed by the FT, I must say, on some of it. But I made those arguments. Those things have now happened. But despite the fact that I've got concerns about the kind of economic impact on those things, a bit of impact on small businesses, the loss of freedom of movement is such a massive impact to our economy. It's a massive impact. People coming here from other countries benefits our economy. It grows our economy. It's such an issue for rural Scotland, for example. It's an issue for even my constituency, which is the third city in Scotland. We really need people to come and live in Aberdeen, particularly because the birth rate in Scotland is even lower than the birth rate down here. So migration is
a number of jokes come to
massively-
mind, but I'll keep them to myself.
Probably best. Migration is really, really important. And if I'd been Theresa May, doing Brexit negotiations, I would have said we need to keep services, we need to keep freedom of movement of services, or freedom of services working because it's such a big part of the UK economy, and we need to keep freedom of movement because the benefits to our society, the benefits to our economy from freedom of movement. And obviously she started by ruling both those things out.
Sophia.
I agree. I don't think there's going to be a referendum anytime soon. I tend to think, George is right. If you look at the polls on this, it's clear they're going in one direction. And, every year the cohorts shift more and more in that way. I also just do think that the realities of geography, history show us that the compulsions to trade more closely and integrate more closely and cooperate more closely with one's partners are there. But I think there is a heck of a lot one can do to improve the current status quo. I mean, there's some things there that, we'll need quite a lot of goodwill on both sides to unlock. And it should be said on some of these things, particularly, for example, on defence industrial cooperation, the EU is absolutely in the wrong place on this and needs to stop this kind of punitive idea of what third countries are. And I think, in the post-Ukraine invasion environment, it's just not at all reasonable to have the UK kind of penalised and pushed outside of that sort of regime. It's not in anyone's interest to do that. It's actually the Europeans who have put youth mobility on the table. And it's interesting because when I was working on the UK-France summit, one thing I think people perhaps didn't realise on that, it was really the French who put mobility on the table in those conversations. And that was because I think for all their ambitions to take over the city of London as the financial capital, they suddenly realized that actually having lost the ability to educate their young people in English was actually quite a loss on their side too. So, I think, look, that this is an opportunity, though. This is where you see that there are mutual benefits on both sides that can be harnessed, and that's where you can get to a place where you can start having serious conversations. So I'd like to see a lot of this low-hanging fruit dealt with. I hope that we can see movement there. I think von der Leyen staying in that role is quite helpful for this, actually. So I think, regardless of what happens at the end of this parliamentary term, we will have a closer relationship with Europe. But it's also really important to remember that the EU itself is changing the EU of 2024 is very different to the EU of 2016. And if you think about a lot of the power dynamics within that, the issues at the top of the table, where they've moved on some of the questions like migration and so on, they are in a very, very different place. So this beast that we are negotiating with and kind of modulating ourselves around, ingratiating ourselves with is also changing too.
Let's give the final word to Steve on this. Living a stone's throw from Dover, I and many I know were very firmly behind Brexit. However, if you asked many of us how we would vote now, we'd vote to rejoin. It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:48. We have a cracking fun question for the end of the programme, which everybody here is looking a bit mystified and wondering what they're going to say. But you will find out in about 8 minutes' time. James is in New Malden. Hello, James.
Good evening, everybody. Is the new price for freedom 4% of GDP plus add-ons, for example, of keeping the blast furnaces in Port Talbot open and building a wafer fab for silicon chips in this country?
Well, that's quite a good question. Let's go to Kirsty.
I knew you were going to come to me first. I don't have a very good answer for this very good question,
sure you do,
unfortunately.
really.
No, I really don't. In terms of the kind of choices that we make, I think that looking across all of the ways in which the UK needs to be resilient and some of the things that we need to prioritise sensible spending on that. We need to prioritise spending on energy security as well as spending on physical security, as well as spending on cyber security. And actually, in terms of some of the defence spending that has been made, I think one of the arguments that I would make is that the government or successive governments have tended to focus on funding defence spending for wars that we can no longer fight, for wars, building things and warships and stuff that are not really as appropriate for today's warfare as putting more money into cybersecurity or putting more money into guys.
This 2.5% of GDP figure, it's extremely arbitrary, and it obviously depends how the economy performs as to how much that is. I would have thought that any strategic defence review ought to be prioritising different things and coming up with a price rather than having it as a percentage of GDP, saying, well, next year we should be spending 60 billion on defence. The following year it should be 70 billion. Wouldn't that be more sensible?
I think in terms of, NATO and thinking about that, it levels the playing field, right? So bigger economies have got to spend more money on it and smaller economies have got to spend less money on it. And that's kind of the point. That's the point of having that figure. And therefore you need to think about, well, we have got to make X amount of contribution. We've got to make 2.5% of contribution, and therefore what are we going to spend it on in order to play our part in adding this? But so that I think that's the logic behind it. But I think you're right. You then have an issue about, if it's going to be significantly bigger next year because the economy is going to be growing faster, or significantly smaller, then we need to make massive changes in spending that we maybe hadn't planned for.
Sophia, you have UK resilience in your job title, so you'll have an interesting view on this. Is James on the right track here?
Yeah, I think we need to be spending a heck of a lot more on defence, but I think the most important thing is that you actually engineer an entire economy and government towards this objective of resilience, because as has been pointed out, resilience is not just about kind of the nuts and bolts of hard power and this kind of traditional conception of security. It cuts across so many different aspects of our economy, democracy, society, and so on. So, and that also, this kind of hard line between what's military, what's civilian, what's commercial, it's actually all starting to merge, because technology is becoming so core to all of this kind of innovation. So what we want is an economy where we've got kind of science, tech, innovation, research, the stuff we're really, really good at the heart of that. And that is producing dividends for our kind of hard power security, but also for our economic growth. That's how it all needs to be working together. And I think the problem is, at the moment, we went through this whole process. We had this integrated review, which was meant to push us towards this posture of starting to think in this joined up kind of way. The reality is we are so far away from proper kind of whole of government approach to all of this. So, and as someone who works in different parts of the system on this stuff, I can tell you, that they're not speaking to each other. The biggest problem from my perception is that the Treasury has not been sold into this idea, right? So they constantly see this kind of zero-sum game between these budget lines, between domestic budget lines that they think people really care about, and the sort of defence budget line, which is seen as this external, international kind of subtext optional thing, right?
But that's where you need a strong Prime Minister and a strong Chancellor to say, well, we know what the institutional story on this is, but we are going to do this and you're going to make it happen.
Yeah, and you need a really, really, really strong cabinet office. That's the really key part here, because they're the ones that will say, you take that direction from the top, from the Prime Minister, you get the cash from the Chancellor, and then they help kind of push it through the system in this integrated way. That's what we need to see.
Lisa.
So are we spending enough on defence? Well, if we were spending 2% 5 years ago, then 2% isn't enough today, because the world is in a different place today than it was. I don't know if 2.5% is the right amount, but I do completely agree with Sophia that you have to look at it in a much more holistic way. You have to look at the soft power that the UK has and that the UK deploys, and you look at things like international development, and you also look at migration and some of the challenges that we have about that, and they all are interconnected. And so I agree with what Sophia there was saying about looking at things both downstream and upstream, and also looking at it more holistically. I don't know if 2.5% is the right amount to spend on defence, but I do think we should be spending more than we used to, because the world is in a different place.
OK, George?
Well, what is certainly true is that I agree with Sophia that the Treasury hates defence spending, with some justification, because look at the wasteful way in which the MOD spends a lot of the money that is given to it by the Treasury, including on, frankly, equipment which is almost obsolete by the time it's been ordered, let alone when it's been built, including these two enormous aircraft carriers, which seem to me to have very little purpose nowadays. So I can see the frustration. I think the point about 2.5% and having that target, although it's arbitrary, and although it probably encourages the MOD to spend money on wasteful projects, I think from a political point of view, it's absolutely vital to show the Americans, particularly Donald Trump, that the European Union is pulling its weight. Well, not sorry, the European Union, NATO members are pulling their weight, because it's one of the things that Donald Trump is absolutely right about, that we'll be hiding under the American security umbrella for far too long. Britain has been one of the better countries in terms of meeting its obligations. Other countries, Germany in particular, have been free riding for too long. And having a target which all countries aspire to meet, I think, is probably a good thing.
Right, we can fit in one question if you are all very quick. So you've got 45 seconds on this. And it's from Yusuf in Norbury. Yusuf, what's your question, please?
Thanks very much. Does the panel agree with me that being an MP is a full-time job? And if an MP has time to host radio programmes like Sorella Braverman did this morning, they're not doing their job properly as an MP, and isn't it time to stop MPs from having other paid employment? And it will keep my blood pressure down first thing in the morning.
Well, I mean, to be fair to Sorella Braverman and the others that are sitting in for James O'Brien this week, it's not a second job. I mean, broadcasting is part of what I'd suppose an MP does. I mean, Lisa Smart...
So at the moment, I'm finding it significantly more than a full-time job, but I guess I'm new and I haven't worked out where the contracts are to get a presenting gig. I do think that it's not as straightforward. I think there are some colleagues in the House who are GPs, for example, or who are scientists and so bring some current expertise. There are also some, like myself, who are still sitting councillors. And while there's clearly an overlap between being a councillor and an MP, they are separate roles that you're elected. Resigned? It costs a lot of money to call a by-election, and I think it's only right and proper to wait till the next election so that it's minimal cost to the taxpayer.
Kirsty.
I think I would agree with Lisa in the fact that there are some MPs with kind of current caseloads, if you like. So there are, Philippa Whitford in one of the previous parliaments was a breast cancer surgeon and kept on some of her current caseload. I would also agree with Lisa in that it is significantly more than a full-time job. And if she figures out how to make it just a full-time job, if she could let me know, that would be really, really helpful. Because, I think there's a significant number of us do not work only 40 hours a week or whatever. There are some MPs as well who've got things like PhD students that they're currently working through, and it's pretty disruptive for your PhD if your professor suddenly disappears in the middle of it. So I think some flex around that, but I think having a regular presenting show on a news TV organisation, for example, or a radio organisation is pushing it a bit far.
I have to say, and I'm not a massive fan of Sorella Braverman, as anyone who listens to the show will know. I thought she did a cracking job this morning. I mean, she did all the radio bits right, and that's not necessarily, as you've seen from this programme, not always an easy thing to do.
There's a very good review of that presenting shift in The Guardian tomorrow, actually, if anyone's interested in it. And John Crace said he thought that she was actually quite reasonable in her tone, which was
praise from the Guardian. Praise indeed.
I mean, I just say on the second jobs thing, I mean, I think the public can make a distinction between MPs who maybe are a GP or maybe have an occasional legal practice or maybe a farmer, and some of the other second jobs that MPs have, which are, people rightly feel very aggrieved about indeed. I think transparency is the best way of dealing with this issue, because it's quite difficult to say what is and what second jobs should be allowed and what shouldn't be. But in the end, the voters should be able to see what their MPs are up to. If they don't like it, then kick them out.
Sophia?
Double the salary, scrap second jobs. That's my view.
Don't double the salary.
Very concisely put. Yusuf, great question. Thank you very much. Now, a fun question is from Heather in Durham. Beyonce has given Kamala Harris permission to use this song, Freedom. She's going to be using that as the walk-on music for her presidential campaign events. What would your walk-on song be? Kirsty?
I'm not sure Beyonce would let me use Freedom, even though it would, totally work with my ethos and our main thrust of things. I'm going to go for a really silly one. I'm going to have the Tigger song from Winnie the Pooh. The wonderful thing about Tiggers is Tiggers are wonderful things. So I've got a tendency to be a bit too bouncy at times, and colleagues get a bit upset at my level of enthusiasm and energy.
Okay, Lisa?
I'm going through a very strong Queen phase at the moment, so I would have Don't Stop Me Now by Queen.
Okay. Sophia?
I would have I Can Do It With a Broken Heart by Taylor Swift, her current single. It has the most extraordinary line, I cry a lot, but I am so productive, it's an art.
George?
Well, given all my family are from the West Country, I think I'm going to have to go for the Wurzels national anthem for Somerset. Drink up thee cider, George. Which, if you've not heard it, is a classic.
Oh, my goodness me. Thank you all very much. Sophia Gaston, Kirsty Blackman, George Parker and Lisa Smart. On tomorrow's panel, we have the General Secretary of the UK's largest union, Unison, Christina McAnee, the Conservative MP, Andrew Rossendale, the Green MP, Dr Ellie Chowns, and the Times political journalist, Jerry Scott. They'll be here to answer your questions from 8 tomorrow. And of course, it's Joe Biden's big speech tomorrow. Unfortunately, it's going to be after we come off air, but I think that's going to be possibly quite a moment. Coming up in the next hour, Charlotte Dujardin, Britain's 3-time Olympic champion, has been forced to pull out of the Paris Olympics over a video showing her hitting a horse repeatedly on the legs during a slow-motion trot. She could have become Britain's most decorated female